Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 182. Putting on a Brave Face. When he walked into the room, he saw Nedzu, Sekijiro, and Hawks already waiting for him, though he made no attempt to greet them. Nomura was looking for somewhere to park her car, so she wasn't there to save him from social interaction. Nedzu and Sekijiro were decent enough to leave him be, but Hawks seemed to have no such qualms. "Eraser, long time no see," he greeted far too nonchalantly than was appropriate for the situation. "Hawks," he replied in a tone that conveyed how little he wanted to talk right now. Just as he had ignored Shota's "don't talk to me" countenance, he ignored his tone as well, walking over and slinging an arm over Shota's shoulder so that he could murmur in his ear, "A word? I don't think we'll have much time to catch up once this is over," he asked. Shota took a deep breath and reminded himself to be grateful. They still wouldn't know where the kids were if it hadn't been for Hawks. So he nodded his head and allowed himself to be led away from prying ears. Hawks didn't say anything, though. He just raked his sharp gaze over Shota, giving him the uneasy feeling that he was being dissected. "Thank you." Shota found himself breaking the silence of his own accord. Those words seemed to satisfy whatever it was Hawks had been looking for. Hawks's shoulders released some tension, and his expression softened. "Yeah, of course. I owe you from before. Both of you. We made a good team." Hawks spoke vaguely. He raised his brow and nodded subtly to communicate that he knew what was really going on here, but he was going to keep his mouth shut. Of course, Hawks put the pieces together. He was just like Ivy, too smart for his own good. Shota nodded back at him in silent thanks. "So I hear I'm your ride out of here." Hawk shifted topics with a devious smirk. "What's your preferred position? Bridal? Fireman? Or you could just hold me like a koala. That's nice too. Makes it feel like a real connection, you know?" Shota didn't bother trying to hide the disappointed sigh that forced itself from his lungs. He ignored the younger hero's rambling and shouldered past him. He didn't know how it was possible, but the man was somehow more insufferable than he remembered. "Come on, Eraser. Communication's important." "We're on in 5. Get to your seats, gentlemen." Nedzu thankfully cut off the taunting. Unfortunately, a press release was unlikely to be any less insufferable than Hawks was. Yaoyorozu decided that they needed to make a stop in a thrift shop nearby to get disguises for the more recognizable of the group. But Hitoshi elected to wait outside. No one knew who he was. Plus, he needed a moment to gather himself after what he'd just done to his own mother and steel himself for what he was most likely going to have to do to his best friend. He knew there wasn't a chance in hell Izuku was going to leave with him if someone else was in danger, and he wasn't going to allow him to play the martyr this time. Kirishima was the first to join him outside. With his hair not gelled up, he already looked different enough. He is not really sure the extra costuming was necessary, but he didn't mention it. He was content to stand in silence, but it seemed Kirishima was not. Do you know what's up with Midoriya and Bakugo?" he asked Hitoshi tentatively while their classmates rooted around the store. Hitoshi shot him a look that said, "What the frick are you on about?" "No, I mean, like, before. They don't really get along. I asked Bakugo, but he just told me to mind my business." "Well, he didn't say that exactly, but I'd rather not repeat what he said," Kirishima clarified with a wry, humorless laugh. Hitoshi studied him for a moment. He was the only one who was here for Bakugo's sake. Well, he supposed Yaoyorozu was here as a neutral party, but for the most part, they were all here for Izuku. Kirishima was the odd man out, and he seemed to realize that. "Why are you friends with him?" Hitoshi asked rather than answering the question. Kirishima huffed out an unamused laugh like he had expected that answer. I know he's a bit prickly, but he's not just a jerk. He cares in his own way. He makes us all work harder, makes us better. Hiroshima trailed off. He clearly cared about Bakugo, but his reasons were beyond Hitoshi's comprehension. They grew up together. I don't really know the whole story. Izuku doesn't like to talk about any of that. He answered after a moment of awkward silence. Kirishima didn't say anything to that, and the tense quiet returned for a moment before he spoke up again. Did Bakugo do that to him? The scars? It looked like... And then he left after... Kirishima trailed off again, seemingly too sickened to speak the thoughts out loud. No, he didn't, he replied before it occurred to him that he didn't know that for sure. He didn't know the story behind most of the scars Izuku had. At least, not that I know of. Hitoshi amended, like I said, Izuku doesn't like to talk about it. Kirishima nodded in acknowledgement, but he stayed quiet after that, which Hitoshi was grateful for. Kirishima was a good guy. He didn't want to be rude to him, but if he started pushing for information about Izuku or lobbying sympathy for Bakugo, then he would have to draw a line. It was hard to ignore the huge TV playing ads in the plaza they were in, but Hitoshi was doing his best. His best wasn't good enough when the screen cut to a flashing image that said, "Breaking news!" At least it saved him from the conversation he was trying his best not to have. This just in, UA has confirmed the allegations that 2 of their students have been kidnapped from the remote summer camp they had been hosting. We're cutting to their live press release now, the woman who filled the screen announced. Fantastic. He really hoped no one recognized them. They could not afford any holdups or distractions right now. He glanced around at the crowd, but everyone was looking up at the screen, not at him or his classmates, who were filing out of the store now. When he looked back up, he saw Principal Nedzu, Aizawa-sensei, and Vlad King all sitting at a pristine white table with microphones in front of them. Aizawa looked about 1,000 times better than the last time Hitoshi had seen him, so it was pretty obvious he was wearing makeup. The scar under his right eye was nothing more than a bit of texture that shone when the light caught it right. It probably wasn't obvious to anyone who didn't know what Aizawa normally looked like, but to Hitoshi, it was like looking at a stranger wearing the mask of his teacher. He supposed that was probably the intent. With his hair pulled back and his face shaved, he looked like a different person, and Eraserhead thrived on anonymity. Even still, it was obvious that he didn't want to be there. Hitoshi was surprised that anyone was able to pull him away from the investigation long enough to clean himself up, much less appear on national television. The first few reporters asked surface-level questions and got surface-level answers. It wasn't anything Hitoshi didn't already know. Of course, it wasn't long before someone who didn't care so much about the delicacy of the situation got his hands on the microphone. You spoke about keeping the students safe, but according to our information, you encouraged them to fight during the attack, putting them in grave danger. What was your reasoning for this? Some entitled prick asked Aizawa. I concluded that because we didn't know the situation, allowing them to use their quirks would help avoid the worst possible outcome. Aizawa responded with no inflection. Hitoshi knew the man well enough by now to know the difference between his usual monotone and his "I'm about to make you regret being born" monotone. That voice was very clearly the latter. And what would that outcome be? Do you think 26 victims and 2 kidnapped children is a win for UA High? The reporter sneered. I assure you, things could have gone much more poorly. I feared every student could have been tortured and killed. Most of the victims were harmed by the gas attack. Nedzu cut Aizawa off in the same calm tone he always spoke with. We've determined it to be the result of a poisonous quirk used by one of the villains. It's thanks to the quick actions of Miss Kendo and Mr. Tetsu. that injuries were kept to a bare minimum. Additionally, we are providing mental health counseling to every student, though at the moment we do not see any signs of serious psychological trauma. So you found a bright spot in this tragedy? The reporter prodded sardonically. We are relieved that an entire class of burgeoning heroes still has a future, Nedzi replied, his tone faltering ever so slightly. And what of the captured students, Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya? What reasons would the League have to take them? They were the top performers in the sports festival. They are clearly very strong, but the entire country saw how violent Bakugo can be. We've all seen the hairline trigger his temper is tied to. They both came from the same school as well, Aldera Junior High, which has since been shut down for, quote, gross negligence and quirk discrimination, close quote, according to an investigation that has been launched by UA itself. These boys clearly have a troubled past. What if they're brainwashing them right now, luring them to the path of evil? How can you sit there and tell us with such certainty that they still have a future? The reporter pressed. Hitoshi could see Aizawa's jaw clench. Vlad was sweating in his seat next to him as Aizawa got to his feet. He was worried the man was about to snap, but he took a deep breath before he spoke. As Bakugo's teacher, I take full responsibility for not curbing his violent tendencies, though I will say his actions come from his conviction to be the best hero he can be. If the villains think they have a chance with him, then they are grossly mistaken. He insisted tersely, but his face softened before he continued. As for Midoriya, it is far more likely that he will convince the League to join a rehabilitation program of their own volition than join their ranks himself. I have seen how deeply he cares for others, especially those who don't deserve that care. As nice as that is, it doesn't amount to real evidence. I didn't ask how you feel. I asked you if you had concrete information. The reporter rebutted. Kami, Hitoshi wanted to wring that man's neck. Aizawa deserved a personal commendation for not vaulting over the table and doing just that. We're doing our best with the intel we have currently available. I have no doubt that the police will break this case very soon. We won't rest until our missing students are returned to UA. Nedzu answered in Aizawa's stead. I think I'm starting to see what he means when he says the press are vultures, Kirishima remarked in a tone too nervous to sound as lighthearted as he had intended. Come on, we need to get going. Uraraka set them all back on task with a stern look in her eye. Even though Aizawa had no way of knowing that Hitoshi was watching, walking away still felt like leaving him to the wolves. It didn't take a genius to see how uncomfortable Eraser was in front of the press, and Keigo couldn't blame him. That one reporter was particularly brutal. He wished he could have been up there instead of Eraser. He knew how to deal with this kind of bullshit, but he wasn't nearly as personally invested anyhow. He'd been keeping a feather on the ground in Uptown every once in a while, so he knew Ivy had been gone. But Eraser was handling things fine on his own. The place wasn't as bad with that gang out of the picture, and preventative measures were a lot easier to implement than dealing with a full-blown infestation. He'd been worried about Ivy, but he knew that Eraser wouldn't be so nonchalant if something terrible had happened to him, so he kept his distance. It was better that way. When Eraser called him, he had hoped to get an explanation, and he supposed he did in the end. The list of people who casually called him Buddy and had a, quote, close personal relationship with ladies of the night in Uptown was about one person long, give or take, so it wasn't difficult to suss out. He'd known Ivy was younger than him, but they must have been 14 when they met. That was... Well, Keigo was still processing that. As much as he wished he could take Eraser's place up there, he wished twice as hard that he could be in Camino Ward and actually doing something to get those kids out of that seedy bar full of villains. However, he had a job to do here, so he stayed put. When Eraser insisted that Midoriya would sooner make honest men of these villains than join the League, Keigo had to bite back a laugh. Because he wasn't wrong about that. He wouldn't have called someone willing to burn an entire forest to the ground and then kidnap two kids a stand-up guy. But after a few hours with one Izuku Midoriya, well, apparently things change. Dabi was a strange man. Keigo had naturally been apprehensive of a villain with a powerful fire quirk and had been tailing him from as much of a distance as he could. There were few commuters this early in the morning, but he had managed to slip a feather into the train car the man was sitting in at the stop at Fuji. He got close enough to get eyes on this target, then fell back. He'd stowed a feather in some woman's bag and let it drift to the floor near the man. Nothing of note happened for a very long time, so much so that he had started to relax slightly. The train car was empty the first time the man he was tailing spoke. "Fire engine red isn't actually that subtle, you know," he snarked. His voice was deep and gruff. Keigo damn near fell out of the sky in shock. He wasn't talking about the feather, right? He couldn't be. It would be crazy to assume that some random feather on the ground belonged to the number 3 hero. No one ever assumed that. Does hair dye work on feathers? Might be a good look for you. But of course, all heroes want is the attention, right? You probably dye them red, don't you? Tell me, does the carpet match the drapes? Okay, no, he was definitely talking to the feather. Shit. Keiko could tell he was getting closer. The man's voice was hushed now, but more audible than before. It felt like he was whispering in Keigo's ear. That whore has more connections than I thought. You did some work in Uptown a couple years ago. Did you spend a few nights with her as a reward? How scandalous. What would the people say if they knew? The number 3 hero, desperate enough to give a prostitute his number? It's kind of sad, actually. The man continued to taunt him. He could feel the feather being gripped and twirled around between the man's pointer finger and thumb. Tough crowd, I guess. I ain't exactly made of money, hotshot. You want to do something and prove I'm not just talking to a feather? I've only got enough cash for one more ticket. If I need to walk around and get spotted again, I'd like to know sooner rather than later. The man drawled lazily. Keigo damn near froze mid-flight again. This guy was letting himself get tailed? That made sense. It would have been incredibly foolish to let himself be seen in public after committing such a high-profile crime. Needless to say, the last 24 hours that led him here had been strange, to say the least. So Eraserhead, damn near sprinting off stage after the cameras cut and gunning straight for him as he stripped off his suit jacket, seemed pretty par for the course. He was about to make another snide comment about shelling out on the first date till he realized why the man was stripping off the layer. His capture weapon had been wrapped around his arms and was now ensnaring Keigo like he was a leashed toddler. I thought we agreed on koala style, not bondage, he complained as he was dragged out the back door. The comment earned him a laugh from Miss Midnight, who had been waiting with him, but Eraserhead ignored them both. As soon as the night sky was above them, Eraser barked for him to go. He could tell that any insistence to check the stability of their connection before taking off would not be received well, so Keigo took hold of the man's forearms for his own peace of mind and did as he was told. Izuku watched Dabi and Toga settle into the nearest booth after she gave him his blanket back, and it didn't take long before both of them fell asleep with their heads on the table. The synchronization was almost impressive. Izuku supposed it made sense if they'd both been up all night. He huffed out a laugh quietly enough to not wake them. What could you possibly be chuckling about right now? Kotsky growled at him. He instinctively shrugged and immediately winced in pain. He had to stop doing that. So, are we getting out of here or what? Kachan ignored his lackluster reply. Soon, he answered. They're asleep. The door's right there. Kotsky rebutted. That was theoretically possible. He could dislocate his thumbs and get these cuffs off. He'd never done it before, but he knew how to in theory because he liked to be prepared. With the cuffs off, he'd have his quirk back, and peeling away the steel box around Kotsky's hands would be a walk in the park. However, the chances of doing all that quietly enough so as to not wake their captors was not something he wanted to tempt. Moreover, even if it worked and they got away, the League would still be at large. No, it was better to wait for rescue when they had enough backup to bring everyone in. Too risky. Would wake them up. Backup won't be long. We just need to be patient, he insisted. Kachan glared at him, but he didn't argue. It was a trend that was starting to become uncomfortable. Kotsky had never been so placid or agreeable. Izuku was starting to wonder if he'd hit his head. Maybe he was just tired. Go back to sleep. I'll keep watch, he instructed. To his astonishment, Kotsky complied without so much as a scoff. He just furrowed his brow, nodded, rested his head on the chair behind him, and closed his eyes. Deku was being weird, and as much as Kotsky was loath to admit it, he was scared. They were kidnapped by villains, though, so of all the times to maybe possibly be something adjacent to afraid, now probably made the most sense. But Deku didn't seem to be scared at all, which was reassuring and unnerving in equal measure. Deku was always scared. So why the hell was now, of all freaking times, when the nerd grew a damn spine? How did he know this Dobby guy? Why did he apparently hang out with hookers? Where did he get so many scars? What the hell was going on with his quirk? Why did he know how to perform stitches? Since when was he from Uptown? And more than any of that, why the frick wasn't he scared? He seemed more frustrated than anything. There had been moments where he seemed frightened, but they were brief and overshadowed by a brash confidence Kotsky had never seen from him. He was handling this situation like it was an average Thursday or Friday or whatever the hell day it was now. He was handling it like a pro. The thought struck Kotsky like a ton of bricks. Deku was handling this like a pro, and Kotsky was trusting him as such. He had his head back and his eyes closed in the middle of a frickin' kidnapping because he trusted Deku enough to have his back, even though he was tied to a chair with quirk-canceling cuffs on him. A lot had changed this year. Deku had changed, and he didn't know what to do with that. For so long, he had just been some annoying ant underfoot, but now Kotsky didn't know him at all. Maybe he never did. Thankfully, whatever crisis of conscience he was having weighed less heavily than his exhaustion. He'd had less than 3 hours of sleep in the last 30 or so hours after 3 days of training from hell, so sleep was welcome at this point. What was less welcome was being woken up. He was half awake after hearing Deku call out to him, but the transition from groggy half-consciousness to his heart rate thudding loud enough to hear it in his ears was more violent. The door that everyone had disappeared through last night slammed open. The two that had dozed off at the table were gone, but that weird jerk was back at the bar, and the busted TV had been replaced. He didn't know why that was a bad thing, but he knew it was. Deku was watching the door that had slammed open behind him, but Kotsky didn't need to wonder who it was for long. Sorry. Did I wake you? Shigaraki cooed with no sympathy. His neck hurt like a bitch, and he had slammed his head against the chair when he'd burst into the room. His head must have fallen forward at some point in his sleep. How long had he been out? Jeez. It must have been hours. He did his best to subtly roll his shoulders, but it didn't do him much good. Why the frick did Deku let him sleep for so long? He looked like shit and had admitted to having slept even less than Kotsky had. The clock told him it was just past noon. Kotsky didn't bother giving a reply. His mouth felt like it was full of cotton and gunked up saliva. He'd kill to brush his teeth right now. Deku was awake like he'd said he'd be, and looking at Shigaraki with vague disdain. He still didn't look scared. What did it mean if Deku was scared of him, but not the literal supervillain who had kidnapped them? I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Shigaraki started. Kotsky scoffed, and both Deku and Shigaraki glared at him. Watch your tone, brat. Shigaraki hissed at him. He wanted nothing more than to spit in the man's face, but he bit his tongue. Deku wanted him to shut it right now, and apparently he was trusting him, so he shut it. Shigaraki muttered something to the mist guy at the bar and came back to them with 2 tall glasses of what appeared to be water. His mouth was sticky, his lips were chapped, and Deku didn't look much better. They were well on their way to dehydration right now. I'm sure you two are parched. I'm not drinking jack shit from you. Kotsky restated his stance from last night. Well, so much for shutting it. Shigaraki's eye twitched, but Deku didn't dispute his claim. Shigaraki let his ring fingers contact the glasses in his hands. The cups turned to dust, and the water spilled across the table and onto the floor. Why are you doing this? Deku spoke up, surprising both of them. Excuse me? Shigaraki spat back. You asked about our motivations yesterday. Now I'm asking yours, Deku answered casually. You've got some nerve, brat, Shigaraki replied through gritted teeth. You're not going to discredit my motivations. You already tried that, so sell me yours. Deku smiled flatly at him. The man paused for a moment and took a deep breath before he spoke. I don't owe you anything, Shigaraki said in a tone of voice that was very poorly restrained. He was about to snap again. And I don't owe you cooperation, Deku countered. Shigaraki shouted wordlessly in frustration, pushed the table to the ground, and stormed out of the room again. Are you trying to get us killed? He spat at Deku when the door slammed shut. I'm trying to get him to leave us alone. He went through the trouble to kidnap us. He's not going to kill us. Yet. Deku replied. Yet? I don't think that trick is going to work a third time, he admitted. Kotsky looked at him for a moment to assess if he was joking. He did not appear to be joking. You're freaking insane! Deku just shrugged and winced again. What a freaking dumbass. Get some sleep. You look like shit, Kotsky ordered. Deku thanked him sardonically, but he did close his eyes, so Kotsky didn't try to call him out on it. He really hoped the damn nerd knew what he was doing. End of chapter.